My wife confessed. My rich CEO proposed to me 3 days ago. And I said yes. I didn't yell. I just told her to give back my ring and get out. Weeks later, she would be the one called me crying, realizing her destiny was, that bone-deep exhaustion that hits after a 12-hour shift at the steel plant? The kind where your muscles ache in places you forgot existed, and the metallic dust seems permanently welded to your skin? Yeah, that was me walking through our front door on what I thought was just another Tuesday evening in suburban hell. My work boots, those trusty Timberlands that had seen more overtime than a divorce lawyer, were caked with enough industrial grime to start their own EPA violation. I'd been looking forward to nothing more exciting than a cold beer, maybe catching the tail end of the game, and pretending that my lower back wasn't screaming bloody murder from hauling steel beams all damn day. But Clara had other plans. Oh, did she ever have plans? She was perched on our second-hand couch, the one we'd bought from a garage sale 3 years ago because we were saving for the future. Looking like she'd been rehearsing whatever bombshell she was about to drop. Her hands were folded in her lap with the precision of a funeral director, and she had that look. You married guys know the one I'm talking about. That, we need to talk, expression that makes your stomach drop faster than a lead balloon and immediately has you mentally cataloging everything you might have screwed up in the past week. I should have known something was seriously wrong when she didn't even acknowledge the fact that I looked like I'd been wrestling with a coal mine and losing. Normally, Clara would have been on my case about tracking dirt through the house, or at least asked how my day went. But no, she just sat there, staring at me with the intensity of a prosecuting attorney about to present their smoking gun evidence. Marcus, she started, and right there I knew we were in deep shit territory because she only used my full name when things were about to go sideways. Usually, it was just Mark or Honey, or on particularly good days, Handsome, though that last one had become about as rare as a unicorn lately. I dropped my lunch cooler by the door and waited, because what else do you do when your wife looks like she's about to deliver news that'll require either celebrating or calling a lawyer? The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap, and I could hear Mrs. Doherty next door running her vacuum cleaner. That woman cleaned house like she was preparing for a military inspection every single evening at precisely 6:30. My CEO, Clara continued, and already my brain was doing that thing where it starts connecting dots you really don't want connected. He proposed 3 days ago. 3 days. 3 fucking days. She'd been sitting on this nuclear bomb for 3 goddamn days while I went to work, came home, kissed her goodnight, and asked about her day like some clueless sitcom husband. I felt my jaw working, but no words came out because, honestly, what do you say to that? Congratulations? Thanks for the heads up? Hope you two will be very happy together? But wait, it gets better. Oh, so much better. And I said yes. The words hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo load of what the actual hell. Not, I'm thinking about it. Not, I need time. Not even, I'm confused. She said yes. Past tense. Done deal. Signed, sealed, and delivered with a bow on top. Here's the kicker, though. She wasn't even crying. I mean, you'd think telling your husband of 5 years that you've accepted another man's proposal might warrant at least a few crocodile tears, right? But no. Clara sat there with her lips doing this weird trembling thing, like she was trying to contain something. And then I realized what it was. Excitement. She was excited. This woman was practically vibrating with anticipation, like she expected me to jump up and throw her a congratulations party or something. The ring, my grandmother's ring that I'd spent 4 months of overtime saving up to buy, working doubles and weekends until my hands were raw and my back felt like it belonged to a 90-year-old man, was still sitting pretty on her finger, catching the light from our cheap IKEA lamp, mocking me with its sparkle. That ring represented every extra hour I'd worked, every dinner I'd missed, every time I dragged my sorry ass out of bed before dawn because I wanted to give her something beautiful, something that said, I love you in a language that cost me blood, sweat, and about $3,000 I didn't really have. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale, because of course I knew who the hell Marcus Hale was, had probably bought his proposal ring with pocket change. The guy was loaded, drove a BMW that cost more than I made in 2 years, and wore suits that probably cost more than our monthly rent. Clara had mentioned him before, always in that breathless way people talk about celebrities. Marcus thinks this, or Marcus said that, or Marcus has such interesting ideas about market strategy. I'd figured it was just workplace admiration, the kind of thing that happens when you work for someone successful. Shows what the hell I know about reading between the lines. I stood there in our living room. Our living room, with the photos of our wedding day on the mantle and the throw pillows Clara had insisted on buying because they tied the room together, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just this crystalline clarity that cut through the exhaustion and the shock like a blade. "Give me back my ring," I said, and my voice sounded weirdly calm, even to me. "Then get out." Clara's eyes went wide like she'd been slapped. "Marcus, wait." "No." The word came out flat, final. "Ring. Now." Her hands shook as she twisted it off her finger, and for a second, just a second, I thought maybe she'd break down, maybe she'd realize what she was throwing away. But then she placed it in my palm with the same detached professionalism she probably used to hand over quarterly reports to dear old Marcus, and I knew we were done. 5 years of marriage, of building a life together, of planning for kids and a bigger house and growing old together, reduced to a piece of metal exchanging hands like a business transaction. Mrs. Doherty's vacuum cleaner had gone quiet next door, and I could practically feel her pressing her ear to the wall. The woman had a PhD in neighborhood drama and a sixth sense for marital discord. By tomorrow morning, half the block would know that the couple in 47B was having difficulties. Clara opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else. Maybe explain herself, maybe try to justify the unjustifiable, but I was already moving toward the door. I'd be damned if I was going to stand there and listen to her tell me about destiny or true love or whatever romance novel bullshit she'd convinced herself justified blowing up our marriage for a guy with a corner office and a trust fund. The ring felt heavier in my palm than it had any right to. Heavier than the steel beams I'd been moving all day. Heavier than the weight of 5 years of shared dreams now lying in ruins. I walked out of that house, our house, and didn't look back, because sometimes the only dignity left in a situation is the dignity of knowing when to leave. Behind me, I could hear Clara calling my name, but it sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted. The evening air hit my face like a slap of reality, and I realized I had absolutely no idea where I was going or what came next. All I knew was that the woman I'd loved enough to work myself into the ground for had just chosen her destiny over our life together, and somehow, walking away felt like the first honest thing either of us had done in months. So there I was at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, standing on my brother Julian's doorstep, like some kind of refugee from my own damn life. The porch light flickered, typical Julian, always meaning to fix things but never quite getting around to it. And I could hear his TV blasting some late-night talk show through the thin walls of his townhouse. The place wasn't much to look at from the outside, built in the 70s when architects apparently thought character meant brown brick and tiny windows, but it was solid, just like Julian himself. I knocked, and after about 30 seconds of shuffling and cursing, probably stubbing his toe on that coffee table he'd been saying he was going to move for the past 3 years, the door swung open. Julian stood there in a pair of boxers and a faded Metallica t-shirt that had seen better decades, squinting at me like he wasn't sure if I was real or just some hallucination brought on by too many beers and not enough sleep. "Well, shit," he said, taking in my appearance. I must have looked like hell warmed over, still in my work clothes, probably smelling like industrial grease and betrayal. "Clara finally kick you out for leaving your socks on the floor?" "Something like that," I muttered, because explaining that your wife of 5 years just announced she's engaged to her boss seemed like the kind of conversation that required more energy than I had left in my tank. Julian, God bless him, didn't push. That's the thing about having a brother who's been through his own share of relationship disasters. He knows when to ask questions and when to just hand you a beer and point toward the couch. He stepped aside, gestured me in with a wave of his hand, and disappeared into what I generously called his kitchen. More like a closet with appliances, but it did the job. The living room looked exactly like you'd expect from a 34-year-old guy who worked construction and spent his free time rebuilding motorcycle engines. Organized chaos. Tools scattered on every surface, motorcycle magazines stacked on the coffee table, and a couch that had probably been decent furniture back when Clinton was president, but now looked like it had survived several natural disasters. and maybe a small war. Here, Julian said, reappearing with a Budweiser and an ancient throw blanket that smelled like motor oil and Old Spice. Make yourself at home. Bathrooms down the hall. And try not to trip over the transmission I've got sitting by the shower. I'll move it tomorrow. That was it. No 20 questions, no demands for details, no helpful suggestions about working things out or seeing a marriage counselor or any of that Dr. Phil bullshit that well-meaning people always seem to think is helpful when your world's imploding. Just a beer, a blanket, and the understanding that sometimes a man needs a place to crash without having to explain why his life's gone sideways. The silence in that little living room was loud as hell, if that makes any sense. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but heavy with all the things I wasn't saying. The TV was still going. Some comedian making jokes about airplane food like it was still 1995, but I wasn't really listening. My brain was stuck on repeat, playing back every conversation Clara and I had had over the past few months, looking for signs I'd missed. Because there had to have been signs, right? Nobody just wakes up one day and decides to blow up their marriage for their boss without some kind of warning system. I cracked open the beer and let my mind wander back to all those late nights Clara had claimed were office deadlines. How she'd started paying more attention to her appearance, buying new clothes she said were professional investments. The way she'd gotten a new phone and suddenly become very protective of it, keeping it face down during dinner and taking it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. The business trips that seemed to multiply like rabbits, and how she'd come home from them looking different. Not tired like you'd expect from traveling and working, but energized. Glowing, almost. Jesus Christ, how much of an idiot had I been? Here I was, busting my ass at the plant, working overtime to pay for her fancy dinners and weekend shopping trips, while she was probably planning her exit strategy with Mr. CEO. All those times she'd mentioned Marcus. Marcus this, Marcus that, and I'd just nodded along like some trusting fool, thinking it was workplace admiration. Hell, I'd probably even encouraged it. That's great, honey. Sounds like you're really making an impression at work. The beer tasted like regret and self-pity, but I kept drinking it anyway, because what else are you going to do when you're camping out on your brother's couch at midnight, wondering how 5 years of your life just evaporated like steam off hot asphalt? The next morning came too early and felt like a punishment. Julian was already gone. He started his shifts at 6, lucky bastard, but he'd left coffee in the pot and a note stuck to the fridge that said cereal's in the cabinet. Milk's probably still good. Lock up when you leave. No questions about how long I'd be staying or what my plans were. Just brotherly logistics and the assumption that I'd figure my shit out eventually. Work was a special kind of torture that day. I dragged myself to the plant still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking like I'd been rode hard and put away wet. The guys on my crew noticed. You can't hide much from people you work alongside 40 hours a week, but nobody said anything directly. They just gave me a little extra space, covered for me when my attention wandered, and didn't complain when I spent most of the safety briefing staring off into the middle distance like a zombie. Hank, my foreman, finally cornered me during lunch break. The guy was built like a brick shithouse and had been working industrial construction since before I was born, so he'd seen every variety of personal crisis that could derail a man's focus on the job. "You good?" he asked, settling his bulk onto the bench next to me in the break room. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, the kind of look that said he'd already figured out I was operating at about half capacity and was trying to decide if I was a safety risk or just having a bad day. I shrugged, because what was I supposed to say? Oh yeah, fantastic. My wife just announced she's marrying her boss, but other than that, life's peachy. Instead, I just took another bite of my sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, because I'd grabbed whatever Julian had in his kitchen and tried to look like a functioning human being. Truth was, my mind kept drifting back to Clara's face when she'd made her little announcement. The way she'd looked almost expectant, like she thought I might congratulate her or something. Like she'd convinced herself that I'd be understanding about the whole situation, maybe even grateful that she'd found her true calling or whatever romantic comedy nonsense she'd been feeding herself. And then there was this voice in the back of my head. The same voice that had been whispering doubts for months, but that I'd been too stubborn or too trusting to listen to, asking all the questions I didn't want answered. Had she been cheating this whole time, or was it just emotional? Did it matter? How long had she been planning this? Had she ever actually loved me? Or had I just been convenient until something better came along? The ring sat in my pocket like a lead weight, a $3,000 reminder of how spectacularly I'd misread my own life. I told myself I'd keep it, not as some pathetic memento of what we'd had, but as proof of what loyalty costs when the other person's already checked out of the relationship. An expensive lesson in the difference between loving someone and being loved back. But even as I sat there in the break room, surrounded by the comfortable noise of guys talking about weekend plans and overtime schedules, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was better off finding out now rather than 10 years down the road when we had kids and a mortgage and even more complicated ways to destroy each other's lives. You know what's funny about rock bottom? It's got this weird way of clarifying your priorities real fast. After 3 days of sleeping on Julian's couch and waking up with a crick in my neck that felt like a pretzel made of pain, I decided it was time to do something that would either make me feel better or at least make me feel different. That something turned out to be walking into Goldstein's Jewelry, the same little shop where I'd bought Clara's ring what felt like a lifetime ago, but was actually just 8 months back. The bell above the door made the same cheerful little ding it had when I'd walked in with hope in my heart, and over time, pay burning a hole in my pocket. Now it sounded like a funeral dirge, which seemed pretty damn appropriate given the circumstances. Arthur Goldstein was behind the counter, same as always, looking like he'd been personally installed there when the shop opened back in 1962. Wire-rimmed glasses, cardigan that had probably been fashionable during the Kennedy administration, and the kind of gentle eyes that had seen every variety of human drama play out over his jewelry cases. He recognized me immediately, probably not hard to do, considering I looked like I'd been hit by a truck and dragged through a gravel pit. His face did this little dance between polite recognition and obvious concern, like he was trying to figure out if I was there to buy something else, or if this was the other kind of visit. The kind that jewelry store owners probably dread, but see more often than they'd like to admit. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that people in the service industry perfect when they're not sure if they're dealing with a happy customer or someone who's about to make their day significantly more complicated. "How can I help you today?" I pulled the ring out of my pocket. My grandmother's ring that had cost me 4 months of doubles and weekends, that had represented everything I thought Clara and I were building together, and set it on the velvet-lined tray between us. It sat there catching the fluorescent lights, still beautiful, still perfect, still completely fucking worthless to me now. "I need to sell this back," I said, trying to keep my voice level and businesslike, like this was just another transaction and not the symbolic dismantling of my entire adult life. Arthur's eyebrows did this little climb toward his hairline, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. He'd been in this business long enough to know that when a guy comes back to sell an engagement ring, it's never because he's redecorating. He picked up the ring with the kind of reverence jewelers reserve for pieces they remember crafting or selling, turning it over in his fingers like he was reacquainting himself with an old friend. "This is a beautiful piece," he said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he remembered exactly how excited I'd been when I'd bought it, how I'd asked him about insurance and proper care, and whether the setting was strong enough to last forever. "Are you sure about this?" "Yeah," I said, probably a little too quickly. "I'm sure." He didn't ask why, which I appreciated. Instead, he just nodded and pulled out his loupe to examine the stone, going through the professional motions of assessing clarity and cut and all those technical details that had seemed so important when I was buying, but now just felt like bureaucratic bullshit standing between me and what I needed. The appraisal took about 10 minutes, during which I stood there listening to the tick of the old clock on the wall and trying not to think about how Clara had looked when I'd first slipped that ring onto her finger. How she'd cried. Actual tears of joy, not the fake waterworks she'd probably been practicing in the mirror for her dramatic confession. How she'd called her mom immediately and spent an hour on the phone describing every detail of the proposal, down to what I was wearing and how nervous I'd looked. "I can offer you $1,800, Arthur said finally, and the number hit me like a slap. $1,800 for something that had cost me $3 grand and about a year of my emotional life. But that's the thing about jewelry. It's only worth what someone else is willing to pay for it. And apparently, used engagement rings don't hold their value any better than used cars or used dreams. "Deal," I said, because what was I going to do, negotiate? Hold out for a better offer? Take it to another jeweler and go through this whole humiliating process again? Arthur counted out the bills with the solemnity of a funeral director, and I signed whatever paperwork he put in front of me without really reading it. The whole transaction felt surreal, like I was watching someone else sell off the remnants of their marriage while I stood there as an observer. But when those $1,800 bills hit my palm, the reality of it crashed over me like a cold wave. I walked straight from Goldstein's to Miller's Tool Supply, 3 blocks down on Industrial Avenue. If I was going to strip my life down to the basics and start over, I might as well invest in things that couldn't betray me, cheat on me, or decide they'd found something better. Tools don't have feelings. They don't get bored with routine or start fantasizing about greener pastures. They just do their job, day after day, reliable as sunrise. The smell of that place, oil and metal and possibility, hit me like a drug. I'd always loved tool stores, even as a kid tagging along with my dad. There's something honest about a place where everything has a specific purpose and nothing is there just to look pretty. Every wrench, every drill bit, every measuring device exists to solve problems and build things that last. I went straight to the electrical section and started filling a basket like I was preparing for the apocalypse. A new multimeter, because my old one had been giving me sketchy readings. A set of conduit benders that would save me time on pipe runs. Safety gear that actually fit properly instead of the hand-me-down crap the company provided. Wire strippers, fish tape, voltage testers. All the tools that would help me do my job better and maybe, if I played my cards right, eventually go independent. Miguel Santos, the union steward, was there picking up some specialty bits for a hospital job. He nodded when he saw my haul, understanding immediately what was happening without needing an explanation. Smart move, he said, hefting a box of self-drilling screws. Can't nobody take your tools away from you. Investment in yourself always pays better dividends than investing in other people. Miguel was one of those guys who'd seen it all in 30 years of electrical work. Boom times and layoffs. Marriages that lasted and marriages that didn't. Young guys who made it and young guys who flamed out. His approval felt like benediction, like someone had just confirmed that I wasn't completely losing my mind. The cashier, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from not yet having life kick you in the teeth, rang up my purchases with obvious envy. Man, that's a sweet setup, he said, running the multimeter over the scanner. You starting your own business or something? Something like that, I said, because it was easier than explaining that I was buying tools with my dead marriage money and hoping they'd help me build a life that made sense. Back at Julian's place, I spread everything out on his kitchen table like a general planning a campaign. The tools gleamed under his cheap fluorescent light, clean and sharp and ready for whatever I could throw at them. No promises they couldn't keep, no hidden agendas, no secret plans to run off with someone richer and more successful. Steel doesn't lie. It bends when you apply the right pressure, breaks when you push it past its limits, and conducts electricity exactly the way physics says it should. It does what it's made to do every single time, without drama or deception or sudden announcements that it's found its true destiny somewhere else. Looking at those tools, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not the nervous kind that comes with wondering what bad news is coming next, but the good kind. The kind that whispers maybe, just maybe, the best parts of my life were still ahead of me instead of behind me. Julian had been dropping hints for 2 weeks, subtle as a brick through a window, but hints nonetheless. Every morning I'd wake up on his couch looking like I'd been wrestling with demons all night. Which, let's be honest, I pretty much had been. And he'd casually mention how his buddy Rick was volunteering with Habitat for Humanity on weekends. Good way to get out of your head, he'd say, pouring coffee that could strip paint. Plus, you know, actually helping people instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for yourself. The feeling sorry for yourself part stung because it was mostly true. I'd been wallowing like a pig in mud for going on 3 weeks now, and while I was getting pretty damn good at it, even I had to admit it wasn't exactly a sustainable life plan. So when Saturday rolled around and Julian handed me a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it, I figured I might as well see what all the fuss was about. Worst case scenario, I'd spend a few hours hammering nails and come home just as miserable as when I left. The build site was in Riverside, one of those neighborhoods that had seen better days but was slowly clawing its way back to respectability. The kind of place where half the houses looked like they'd been loved back to life by people who gave a damn, and the other half looked like they were still waiting for someone to notice they existed. A cluster of volunteers was already gathered around a half-framed house, coffee cups in hand, looking like the kind of people who got up early on weekends because they actually wanted to, not because their alarm clock was a sadistic bastard with a grudge. I parked Julian's truck. My car was still at the house with Clara, along with most of my other worldly possessions, a situation I hadn't quite worked up the energy to deal with yet, and walked over to what looked like the command center. A folding table covered with blueprints, permits, and enough clipboards to stock a small bureaucracy. Standing behind it all, somehow managing to look completely in control of the beautiful chaos, was this woman who I'd later learn was Elise. First thing I noticed about her wasn't that she was pretty, though she was, in that no makeup, pulled back hair, work clothes kind of way that suggested she had better things to do than worry about impressing anybody. No, the first thing I noticed was that she looked competent, like she knew exactly what she was doing and had probably been doing it long enough to handle whatever curveball Saturday morning might throw at her. "You must be Marcus," she said, looking up from a clipboard with a smile that managed to be both welcoming and businesslike. Julian called ahead. "Said you were handy with electrical work." "That's the rumor," I said, trying to remember how normal human interactions were supposed to work. It had been a while since I'd talked to anyone who wasn't either my brother, my coworkers, or the guy at the convenience store who'd gotten tired of hearing about my personal problems every time I bought beer. She handed me a hard hat that had seen some serious action and a pair of safety glasses that looked like they'd been donated by someone's grandfather. "Great. We're running electrical lines today, and Tony," she pointed to a gray-haired guy who was measuring something with the intensity of a NASA engineer, "could use an extra pair of hands. He's been doing this since Carter was president, so try to keep up." Tony turned out to be one of those guys who'd probably forgotten more about electrical work than most people ever learn. Retired from the city electric department, union man through and through, with hands like leather gloves and the kind of patience that comes from spending 40 years teaching apprentices not to electrocute themselves. He took one look at my new tools, which I'd brought along like some kind of security blanket, and nodded approvingly. "Nice gear," he said, hefting my voltage tester. "Man who takes care of his tools usually takes care of his work. Let's see what you got." What followed was 4 hours of the most therapeutic manual labor I'd experienced in years. Not the soul-crushing, paycheck-chasing grind of the steel plant, but work that had purpose beyond just keeping the lights on and the bills paid. Every wire we ran, every outlet we installed, every circuit we completed was going to make life better for some family I'd never meet. There was something clean about that, something honest that cut through all the emotional static that had been jamming my mental frequencies for weeks. The house was going to Renee Martinez, a single mom with 2 kids who'd been living in an apartment that probably violated about 15 housing codes. She stopped by around noon with sandwiches for the crew, and when she thanked me, like I was doing her some huge favor instead of just trying to keep my hands busy and my brain from eating itself, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not happiness, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple satisfaction of doing something useful for someone who needed it. During lunch break, I found myself sitting on a stack of lumber next to Elise, eating a sandwich that tasted better than anything I'd had in weeks. Maybe because I'd actually worked up an appetite instead of just going through the motions of eating because my body required fuel. "So," she said, not looking at me directly, but somehow managing to make the question sound casual instead of nosy. "What's your story?" It was the kind of question that could go a dozen different ways. I could have given her the standard small talk response. Job, weather, how about them Yankees? I could have unloaded the whole sorry saga of Clara and Marcus and the engagement ring that was now paying for the tools sitting in my truck. Instead, I surprised myself by going with something that felt like the truth without being the whole truth. "I needed to start building something real again," I said, and realized as the words came out that they were more accurate than I'd expected them to be. She nodded like that made perfect sense, which it probably did to someone who spent her weekends helping strangers build houses they could actually afford. "That's what this is all about," she said, gesturing toward the half-finished frame around us. "Building something that matters. Something that lasts." The afternoon went faster than I'd expected. Tony walked me through some finer points of residential electrical codes, shared a few tricks he'd picked up over the decades, and generally treated me like someone worth teaching instead of just another pair of hands. By the time we called it quits at 4, I felt like I'd actually accomplished something instead of just survived another day. As I was loading my tools back into the truck, Elise appeared at my elbow with that clipboard of hers, looking like she was about to ask me something but wasn't quite sure how. "We're back here next Saturday," she said finally. "Same time, probably similar work. Could use someone who knows what they're doing with a wire stripper." It wasn't exactly a life-changing invitation, but it felt like something. A reason to get up next weekend that didn't involve feeling sorry for myself or cataloging all the ways my life had gone sideways. A chance to build something instead of just tearing things down. "See you next week?" she asked, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, saying yes felt like the easiest thing in the world. "Yeah," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. "I'll be here." You'd think that after 3 weeks of radio silence, a man could start to believe he might actually be done with the drama. That maybe, just maybe, his soon-to-be ex-wife had enough basic human decency to let him lick his wounds in peace while she planned her shiny new life with Mr. Corner Office. But if you thought that, you'd be giving Clara way too much credit for having anything resembling shame or self-awareness. I was actually having a decent Saturday morning for once. Julian had made pancakes, and I'm talking real pancakes, not the frozen garbage that tastes like cardboard with syrup on it. And I was feeling something that might have been optimism creeping around the edges of my consciousness. The habitat build from the week before had left me sore in all the right ways, and I was looking forward to getting back out there, working with my hands, building something that mattered instead of just grinding through another shift at the plant. Then Julian, who'd been scrolling through his phone while inhaling his third cup of coffee, made this noise. Not quite a whistle, not quite a laugh, but the kind of sound that immediately puts you on high alert because it usually means someone's about to show you something that's going to ruin your day. "Dude," he said, turning his phone toward me with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a car accident in slow motion. "You need to see this shit." Facebook. Of course it was fucking Facebook. Because apparently, the universe has a sense of humor, and that sense of humor involves social media algorithms designed to show you exactly the content most likely to make you want to throw something heavy through a window. There they were. Clara and Marcus, looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread about power couples who make you sick. Matching outfits. Because apparently when you're in love with your boss, you coordinate your wardrobe like you're running for office together. Clara was wearing this dress I'd never seen before, probably cost more than I made in a week, and Marcus was in one of those casual blazers that somehow managed to scream, "I have more money than you'll ever see," while pretending to be laid back. The photos were professional, the kind you pay someone with expensive equipment to take in locations that look effortlessly romantic but probably required a permit and a small crew to set up. Golden hour lighting, perfectly arranged poses, captions that read like they'd been focus grouped by a team of romance novel writers. True love conquers all, and when you know, and my personal favorite, finding my soulmate in the most unexpected place. Unexpected, right? Because apparently meeting the man who signs your paychecks and then climbing the corporate ladder on your back was just a beautiful coincidence orchestrated by fate itself. I handed the phone back to Julian and tried to pretend that seeing them together didn't feel like getting punched in the kidney by someone wearing brass knuckles. "Good for them," I said, and Julian snorted like I'd just claimed the earth was flat. "You're full of shit," he said, but not unkindly. "But I appreciate the effort." Sunday morning hit me like a hangover I didn't earn. I was lying on Julian's couch, staring at the water stain on his ceiling that looked like either Texas or a dead fish depending on the angle, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number, which in my experience never meant good news. Could have been a telemarketer, could have been someone from work, could have been the IRS calling to inform me that my life was about to get even more complicated. Turns out, it was worse than all of those options combined. The text was from Clara. How she'd gotten a new number, or whose phone she was using, I didn't know and didn't particularly care. What mattered was the content, which managed to be so spectacularly tone-deaf that I actually read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. "Hi Marcus, I hope you're doing well. I know this might seem awkward, but I was hoping you could help me with something. Marcus and I found the perfect venue for our wedding, but we need to put down a deposit this week to secure the date. I'm a little short on cash right now, between the engagement party and ring shopping. Things have been expensive lol, and I was wondering if you could lend me $3,000 to help cover it? I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I can. But wait, there was more. Because apparently Clara had decided that asking her estranged husband for wedding money wasn't quite audacious enough for one text message. Also, the caterer is offering a 15% discount for union members, and since you're still technically my husband, I was hoping you could sign the contract so we can get the better rate. It would really help us save money for the honeymoon. Thanks so much. XOXO. I sat there staring at my phone like it had just grown legs and started tap dancing. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was almost impressive in its completeness. She wanted me to bankroll her wedding to another man and help her save money on the reception by using my union membership. It was like she'd sat down and brainstormed the most insulting possible request she could make, then decided to double down and make it worse. Julian wandered over with his coffee mug, took one look at my face, and immediately went into concerned brother mode. What now? I handed him the phone without a word. Watched his eyebrows climb toward his hairline as he read, watched his jaw clench, watched him shake his head like he was trying to clear water out of his ears. Are you fucking kidding me? He said, loud enough that Mrs. Chun next door probably heard him through the walls. She wants you to pay for her wedding? To another guy? Jesus Christ, Marcus, what kind of person does that? The kind of person who's so wrapped up in her own fantasy romance that she's completely lost touch with basic human decency, apparently. The kind of person who somehow convinces herself that her ex-husband should be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to her new happiness. The kind of person who uses LOL in a text message asking for $3,000 like it's all just one big hilarious misunderstanding. I screenshot the message and sent it to Julian, partly for evidence and partly because I needed someone else to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. Then I started typing my response, deleted it, started again, deleted that too. Every version I came up with was either too angry or not angry enough, too detailed or not detailed enough. Finally, I settled on something that felt appropriately final. No. Find another way. You chose your destiny. Figure it out. I hit send, immediately blocked the number, and felt something click into place in my chest. Not satisfaction, exactly, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from finally drawing a line in the sand and meaning it. Julian was reading over my shoulder. Short and sweet, he said approvingly. Gets the point across without giving her anything to argue with. Ralph Morrison, our union lawyer, happened to call that afternoon about some pension paperwork, and when I mentioned Clara's little request, leaving out the more humiliating details, he whistled low and long. Keep those messages, he said, his voice taking on that professional tone that meant he was already thinking 3 moves ahead. If she keeps harassing you, we're going to want documentation. And Marcus? Don't sign anything with her name on it. Union discount or no union discount. That's the kind of shit that comes back to bite you in the ass during divorce proceedings. As if I needed another reminder that this whole mess was just getting started. That evening, I got a message from Dana, Clara's cousin, someone I'd actually liked during the brief period when I thought I was part of Clara's family instead of just a temporary placeholder. Not all of us support what she's doing, it said. Just wanted you to know that. It was a small kindness, but it helped. Nice to know that not everyone in Clara's orbit had completely lost their minds or their moral compass. Nice to know that someone else recognized that asking your husband to finance your wedding to another man crossed about 15 different lines of basic human decency. I added Clara's new number to my growing collection of blocked contacts and tried to focus on the things in my life that actually made sense. Tools that worked when you used them properly. Electrical circuits that followed predictable laws of physics. Brothers who had your back even when you were sleeping on their couch and probably overstaying your welcome. And somewhere in the back of my mind, the memory of Elise asking if I'd be back next Saturday. Like maybe there were still good people in the world who did things for the right reasons instead of whatever self-serving bullshit was motivating my soon-to-be ex-wife. Yeah, I'd definitely be back next Saturday. Because building something real was starting to sound a lot better than dealing with whatever fresh hell Clara might cook up next. Monday morning rolled around like a freight train carrying a cargo load of purpose, and for the first time in weeks, I actually wanted to be somewhere other than Julian's couch feeling sorry for myself. Hank had pulled me aside Friday afternoon with news that felt like winning the lottery. I was getting assigned to the hospital renovation project downtown. Not just any hospital work, but the kind of precision electrical installation that required actual skill instead of just the ability to follow directions and not electrocute yourself. St. Mary's Medical Center was undergoing a complete electrical overhaul. New surgical suites, updated ICU, the works. The kind of job where every wire had to be perfect because people's lives literally depended on the lights staying on and the equipment working exactly when it was supposed to. No room for shortcuts, no tolerance for good enough, and definitely no space for letting personal bullshit interfere with getting things right. The building itself was one of those 1960s concrete monuments that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought welcoming was a dirty word, but the inside was all state-of-the-art medical equipment and gleaming corridors that smelled like disinfectant and purpose. Dr. Patricia Simmons, the facilities director, met our crew on the first morning and laid out the expectations with the kind of clarity that made you understand why she'd risen to run operations at a major medical facility. "Gentlemen," she said, looking each of us in the eye like she was taking our measure and deciding whether we were worth her time. "This isn't just construction work. Every circuit you install, every outlet you wire, every connection you make could be the difference between someone living and dying. I need you to understand that and work accordingly." It was exactly the kind of pressure that would have sent some guys running for easier jobs, but it hit me like a shot of adrenaline. This was work that mattered in ways that went beyond paychecks and overtime hours. This was the kind of job where you could look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and know that you'd actually contributed something meaningful to the world instead of just taking up space and consuming oxygen. The electrical codes for medical facilities are no joke, stricter than anything residential or even most commercial work. Every connection had to be perfect, every ground had to be tested and retested, every circuit had to meet specifications that would make a NASA engineer proud. It required the kind of focus that left no room for thinking about anything else, which turned out to be exactly what my brain needed. Kyle Morrison, one of the younger apprentices on the crew, got assigned as my helper, and the kid reminded me of myself about 10 years ago. Eager to learn, quick with his hands, but still green enough to ask questions that kept me on my toes. There's something about teaching someone else that forces you to really understand what you're doing instead of just going through the motions, and Kyle had enough genuine curiosity to make the whole process feel like something other than just another day at work. "Why do we need isolated ground circuits in the ICU?" he asked while we were running conduit through a ceiling space that felt like the inside of an oven. "Because when someone's hooked up to life support equipment, you don't want any electrical interference screwing with the signals," I explained, trying to remember what it felt like to be new enough to the trade that everything seemed like magic instead of just applied physics. Regular electrical noise that wouldn't even register on most equipment could kill someone whose heart is depending on a pacemaker to keep beating. The kid nodded like I'd just revealed the secrets of the universe, and something about his enthusiasm reminded me why I'd gotten into electrical work in the first place. Not for the money, though union wages weren't anything to complain about, but for the satisfaction of understanding how things worked and making them work better. Meanwhile, my Saturday mornings at Habitat had become the highlight of my week. Elise and I had fallen into an easy rhythm of working together, and somewhere between running wire through studs and installing outlet boxes, she'd started asking me about more than just voltage requirements and circuit loads. Nothing heavy, nothing that felt like prying, just the kind of casual conversation that happens when two people spend enough time working side by side. 3 weeks into the routine, she suggested coffee after we wrapped up for the day. Not a date, exactly. More like two adults who discovered they enjoyed each other's company, extending that enjoyment beyond the construction site. We ended up at Murphy's Diner, one of those places that had probably been serving the same menu since the Eisenhower administration and was proud of it. "So," she said, stirring sugar into coffee that could probably strip paint, "you ready to tell me what really brought you to Habitat?" It was the kind of question I'd been expecting for weeks, and I'd rehearsed a dozen different answers in my head. Something vague about wanting to give back to the community, or needing a creative outlet, or just having time on my hands. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. "My wife left me for her boss," I said, and the words came out easier than I'd expected them to. 5 years of marriage, and she decided I was holding her back from her destiny or some shit like that. I needed to do something that felt like building instead of just surviving. Elise nodded like that made perfect sense instead of being the kind of personal disaster that usually makes people uncomfortable. I'm sorry you were treated that way, she said, and the simplicity of it. No platitudes about everything happening for a reason, no suggestions that I was probably better off without her. Felt like the first honest response I'd gotten from anyone outside my immediate family. Yeah, well, I said, trying for the kind of casual tone that suggested I was completely over it and definitely not still carrying around a $3,000 grudge in the form of new tools. Turns out some people aren't as committed to building things as they pretend to be. She smiled at that, not the pitying smile that people give you when they're trying to make you feel better, but the kind of smile that suggests they understand exactly what you're talking about. That's why I like construction, she said. When you build something right, it stays built. No surprises, no sudden changes of heart. Just solid work that does what it's supposed to do. That night, I actually slept through the night without waking up at 3 in the morning with my brain spinning through all the ways my life had gone sideways. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but it was something close to peace. The kind of peace that comes from spending your days doing work that matters and your weekends building things that last, surrounded by people who understand the difference between promises and commitment. Julian noticed the change when I came home that evening. You look almost human again, he said, which from him was practically a declaration of undying love and support. Yeah, I said, settling onto his couch with a beer that actually tasted good instead of just necessary. I'm starting to remember what that feels like. And for the first time since Clara had dropped her bombshell about finding her destiny in someone else's bed, I actually believed it might be true. 6 months. That's how long it took for me to stop jumping every time my phone buzzed, stop scanning Facebook for updates about Clara's fairy tale romance, and stop feeling like I was walking around with a gaping hole where my chest used to be. 6 months of hospital electrical work that demanded precision, Saturday mornings at Habitat that reminded me what building something worthwhile felt like, and coffee with Elise that had gradually evolved from post-work debriefing to the kind of easy conversation that made me remember why I used to enjoy talking to another human being. I was actually having a good day. Kyle had successfully installed his first medical-grade outlet box without needing me to check his work twice. Dr. Simmons had complimented our crew on staying ahead of schedule, and I'd managed to solve a particularly tricky conduit routing problem that had been giving me grief for 3 days. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was actually moving forward instead of just treading water in the wreckage of my old life. Then Aaron Morrison, not to be confused with Kyle. Aaron was my buddy from high school who'd somehow managed to keep track of everyone from our graduating class despite the fact that most of us had scattered to the 4 winds, sent me a text that made my blood run cold and vindicated at the same time. Dude, have you heard? Now, in my experience, texts that start with "have you heard" never contain good news. They're usually followed by information about someone getting arrested, divorced, fired, or some combination of all three. But this particular "have you heard" was different. This one carried the weight of cosmic justice finally catching up with someone who'd had it coming for a long time. I called Aaron back instead of texting, because some conversations require actual human voices instead of little digital messages that can be misunderstood or taken out of context. "Marcus Hale," Aaron said without preamble, the way he always did when he had gossip that was too good to ease into gradually. "Your boy Marcus Hale is in some deep shit." "He's not my boy," I said automatically, though I had to admit hearing that the golden prince of Clara's destiny was having problems sent a little thrill of satisfaction through my nervous system. Well, whatever he is, he's apparently been screwing around on Clara with at least 3 different women that we know about. Hotel receipts, credit card statements, the whole 9 yards. And get this, one of them filed a police report after Clara confronted her in a parking garage downtown. The information hit me in waves. First came the vindication, that little voice in my head that had been whispering, "I told you so," for months finally getting to speak up. Then came something I hadn't expected, genuine concern for Clara. Because nobody, not even someone who'd ripped your heart out and asked you to pay for the privilege, deserved to get their face rearranged by their cheating fiancé. "Is she okay?" I asked and meant it. Whatever else Clara had done, whatever lies she'd told herself about destiny and true love, she didn't deserve to end up in the emergency room, because Prince Charming turned out to have anger management issues. Physically? Yeah, she's fine. Emotionally? Well, let's just say the engagement photos have disappeared from Facebook, and she's been posting a lot of stuff about learning to trust yourself and recognizing red flags. Aaron paused, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. Looks like Destiny had some fine print she didn't read. After I hung up, I sat in Julian's kitchen staring at my coffee and trying to process how I felt about this latest development. Part of me, the petty, vindictive part that had been carrying around 6 months of anger and humiliation, was doing a little victory dance. Clara's perfect CEO had turned out to be exactly the kind of guy you'd expect. Rich, charming, and completely incapable of keeping his dick in his pants. The fairy tale had crashed and burned, just like anyone with half a brain could have predicted. But there was another part of me, a part one didn't particularly like but couldn't ignore, that felt genuinely sorry for her. Because I remembered what it felt like to believe in someone completely, to trust them with your whole heart, only to find out that everything you thought you knew about them was bullshit. I remembered the way Clara had looked when she'd told me about Marcus's proposal. That glow of absolute certainty that she'd found her person, her future, her happily ever after. Finding out that person was a fraud had to hurt like hell, even if she'd brought it on herself. My phone started lighting up around dinner time. First one voicemail, then another, then a third. All from numbers I didn't recognize, which meant Clara had either gotten herself a bunch of new phones or was borrowing other people's to get around the fact that I'd blocked her usual number. I let them go to voicemail at first, but curiosity eventually got the better of me. The first message was what you'd expect. Tears, apologies, rambling explanations about how she'd made a terrible mistake and never stopped loving me. The second one got more specific, with details about Marcus's other women and how she'd been so blind and should have listened to her instincts. By the third voicemail, she was talking about reconciliation like we were renegotiating a cell phone contract instead of discussing the smoking ruins of a 5-year marriage. Marcus, I know you're probably angry, she said in message number 4. Her voice that particular combination of tearful and determined that I remembered from every major argument we'd ever had. But we had something real, something that lasted 5 years. That has to count for something. We can work through this. We can start over. I've learned so much about myself these past few months, and I know now that what we had was special. Please call me back. Please. I saved every single message, because Ralph Morrison had drilled it into my head that documentation was everything when it came to divorce proceedings. But more than that, listening to them felt like watching someone I used to know trying to rewrite history in real time. Like Clara genuinely believed that our marriage had been some kind of trial separation instead of her deciding that I wasn't good enough for her anymore. Ralph himself called the next morning, which was either good timing or evidence that lawyers have some kind of sixth sense for when their clients are about to need their services. Keep those voicemails, he said after I'd given him the general outline of the situation. Don't respond to them. Don't engage. Just keep a record of everything. If she escalates this, and trust me, they usually do, we're going to want proof that you tried to maintain reasonable boundaries. What if she shows up at Julian's place? I asked, because that possibility had been keeping me awake since the call started. Then you call the police and let them handle it. You're not her husband anymore, Marcus. You don't owe her a conversation, you don't owe her forgiveness, and you sure as hell don't owe her a second chance just because her backup plan didn't work out. That afternoon, I turned off my phone completely and went for a long walk around Julian's neighborhood, past the houses where normal people lived normal lives, where marriages either worked or didn't, but didn't involve CEOs and destiny, and asking your ex-husband to finance your wedding to another man. Past the park where kids were playing on swings and couples were walking dogs, and everything felt manageable and real. When I got back to Julian's place, I plugged my phone back in and watched 17 more missed calls populate my screen. But for the first time since this whole nightmare started, the constant buzzing didn't make my stomach clench with anxiety. Instead, it just sounded like noise, distant, irrelevant noise that had nothing to do with the life I was actually building. I muted Clara's new numbers and went back to planning conduit runs for Monday's work at the hospital. Because some people's emergencies are just other people's Tuesday afternoons, and I had real work to do for people who actually mattered. Saturday mornings had become my sanctuary. After 5 days of hospital electrical work that required the kind of precision that left no room for mental wandering, and 5 nights of Clara's increasingly desperate voicemails that I'd stopped listening to after the first few words, my weekends at Habitat felt like stepping into a parallel universe where things made sense and people meant what they said. Elise and I had developed this routine where we'd grab coffee after the build, usually at Murphy's Diner, sometimes just sitting on the tailgate of my truck if the weather was decent. Nothing heavy, nothing that felt like we were trying to define what we were doing. Just two adults who discovered they enjoyed each other's company talking about everything from electrical code violations to her ongoing battle with the city planning committee over permit delays. This particular Saturday had been especially good. We'd finished the electrical rough-in on the Martinez house 2 days ahead of schedule. Renee had stopped by with homemade tamales that were better than anything you could get at a restaurant, and Tony had finally admitted that I knew what I was doing with conduit bending, which from him was basically a declaration of professional respect. Elise had suggested we take our coffee back to my place. Well, Julian's place, but she knew the situation. Instead of sitting in the diner where the coffee was strong enough to dissolve metal, and Mrs. Patterson from down the street always tried to eavesdrop on our conversations. It seemed like a natural progression, the kind of small step forward that didn't feel loaded with expectations or hidden agendas. We were sitting on Julian's back balcony, which was maybe 8 feet by 8 feet of concrete and determination, but had a decent view of the neighborhood and caught the afternoon sun just right. Elise was telling me about her ongoing war with the permit office downtown. Apparently getting approval to build affordable housing required navigating more bureaucratic red tape than launching a space mission when the knock came. Not the polite, reasonable knock of someone who respects boundaries and understands that showing up unannounced might not be welcome. This was the kind of persistent, demanding knock that says, "I'm not leaving until you answer this door, so you might as well get it over with." The kind of knock that immediately puts you on high alert because it usually means your day is about to get significantly more complicated. I looked at Elise, who raised her eyebrows in a way that said, "Expecting someone." I shook my head and made my way through Julian's living room, past the motorcycle engine that he'd finally moved from beside the shower to beside the couch, and toward the front door with the kind of dread that comes from knowing exactly who was on the other side. Clara. Of course it was Clara. Because apparently 6 months of blocked numbers, ignored voicemails, and complete radio silence hadn't been clear enough communication that I wasn't interested in whatever reconciliation fantasy she'd been cooking up in her head. She looked like hell, which should have made me feel vindicated but instead just made me tired. Hollow-eyed, thinner than I remembered, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked like she'd grabbed them off the floor of her closet without checking if they matched. Her hair, which had always been her pride and joy, professionally styled every 6 weeks, products that cost more than my work boots, was pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she'd given up caring about appearances somewhere around the time her CEO, Prince, turned out to be a fraud. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried that particular combination of desperation and determination that I recognized from every major fight we'd ever had. "We need to talk." "No," I said, not moving from the doorway. "We really don't." But Clara had apparently spent the drive over-rehearsing this conversation, because she launched into what sounded like a prepared speech without acknowledging that I'd already given her my answer. "I know you're angry," she said, the words tumbling out like she was afraid I'd close the door before she could get them all out. "I know I hurt you, and I know what I did was wrong. But Marcus, the other Marcus, he wasn't who I thought he was. He lied to me. He cheated on me. He made me believe that we had something real when all along he was just using me." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, but pointing that out seemed unnecessarily cruel. Instead, I just waited for her to finish her pitch, because experience had taught me that Clara needed to say her piece before she could hear anything else. "I've had 6 months to think about what I threw away," she continued, her voice getting stronger as she warmed to her theme. 5 years, Marcus. 5 years of building a life together, of planning for the future, of being a team. That has to count for something. That has to be worth fighting for. That's when she noticed Elise, who had appeared behind me in the doorway like some kind of calm, competent guardian angel. Clara's eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again as she processed what Elise's presence might mean. "Oh," Clara said, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she recalculated her strategy on the fly. I didn't realize you had company. This is Elise, I said, not offering any additional explanation because Clara had forfeited the right to details about my life when she decided I wasn't good enough for her anymore. Clara looked at Elise, really looked at her, taking in the work clothes, the lack of makeup, the general air of someone who had better things to do than stand around on stoops having dramatic conversations about failed marriages. Then she looked back at me with something that might have been accusation. "So you're throwing away 4 years for someone you barely know?" she said, and there it was. The real Clara, the one who showed up when things didn't go according to her script. Not the apologetic, repentant version who'd been leaving voicemails, but the woman who couldn't believe that anyone would choose differently than she would. "For years," I said, and felt something click into place in my chest. "You mean 5 years? 5 years of marriage that you ended the minute you said yes to another man's proposal. And I'm not throwing anything away. You already did that." That's when it hit me, standing there in Julian's doorway with the woman I'd loved for half a decade demanding that I take her back now that her backup plan had crashed and burned. Clara didn't miss me. She missed what I represented: stability, reliability, someone who would be there no matter how badly she screwed up or how many times she decided that the grass was greener somewhere else. "You don't miss me," I said, and the words came out calmer than I felt. "You miss having a safety net. You miss knowing that no matter what stupid decision you made, I'd be here waiting to pick up the pieces. But I'm not your backup plan, Clara. I'm not your fallback option for when your first choice doesn't work out." Her face went through about 6 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Surprise, anger, hurt, calculation, and finally something that looked like understanding. Not acceptance, but at least recognition that this conversation wasn't going the way she'd planned. "I deserve someone who chooses me first," I continued, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Not someone who chooses me because everyone else turned out to be a disappointment." Clara opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, wanted to explain how this was different, how she'd learned and grown and realized what really mattered. But I was already closing the door, gently but firmly, because some conversations can't be fixed with more talking. "Marcus, wait," she called through the door, but I was already walking back toward the balcony where Elise was waiting with our coffee and the kind of peaceful Saturday afternoon that I'd earned by finally learning the difference between being loved and being convenient. Elise didn't ask questions when I settled back into my chair. She just handed me my coffee and said, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, and realized I actually meant it. I really am. Because for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like I was choosing my own life instead of just reacting to everyone else's decisions about what my life should look like. 3 months passed before Clara decided to make her final play, and by then, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to live with that constant low-level anxiety that comes from never knowing when your ex-wife might show up to turn your day inside out. 3 months of steady work at the hospital, where we'd moved from rough electrical to finish work, and I'd been promoted to crew lead after Kyle successfully installed his first complex surgical suite lighting system without needing me to check every connection twice. 3 months of Saturday mornings at Habitat, where Elise and I had moved from coffee after work to dinner before work to spending entire weekends together working on her own fixer-upper townhouse. It wasn't love yet, or maybe it was, but neither of us was in any hurry to define it or make declarations or do any of that relationship milestone bullshit that always seems to ruin perfectly good things. It was just easy, comfortable in a way that didn't require constant maintenance or walking on eggshells or wondering what mood someone was going to be in when you got home from work. Elise asked questions because she was genuinely interested in the answers, not because she was looking for ammunition for future arguments. She laughed at my jokes because she actually thought they were funny, not because she was keeping score of how supportive she was being. I was installing a new outlet in her kitchen. GFCI protected because electrical safety is sexy, and if you don't think so, you've clearly never dated an electrician when the knock came. Not at her place, at Julian's, but somehow I knew. Maybe it was the way my phone had been buzzing with unknown numbers for the past week. Or maybe it was just the kind of cosmic timing that seems to govern these situations, but I knew without being told that Clara had decided to make one more attempt at rewriting history. Julian called while I was explaining to Elise why kitchen outlets need to be GFCI protected even when the local code doesn't specifically require it. Your ex-wife is here, he said without preamble, and she brought reinforcements. Reinforcements? Her mother. They're both sitting in my living room looking like they're about to conduct a hostage negotiation. You want me to tell them to get lost, or are you going to come deal with this yourself? I looked at Elise, who was holding a wire nut and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she'd already figured out what was happening. You need to go, she said, not a question but a statement delivered with the kind of calm certainty that had become one of my favorite things about her. Come with me, I said, partly because I wanted the moral support and partly because I was done hiding the good parts of my life from the people who'd tried to destroy them. 20 minutes later, we walked into Julian's living room to find Clara and her mother Judith arranged on the couch like they were conducting a board meeting. Clara had clearly made an effort, hair done, makeup applied, wearing the kind of dress that suggested this was an occasion that required looking her best. Judith, meanwhile, was dressed like she was attending a funeral, all black and severe angles, and the kind of expression that suggested she was personally offended by my continued existence. Marcus, Clara said, standing up with the kind of smile that belonged in a political campaign ad. Thank you for agreeing to see us. I didn't agree to anything, I said, staying by the door because sitting down would have suggested this was a conversation instead of just me being polite long enough to hear whatever final desperate pitch they'd rehearsed on the drive over. Judith jumped in before Clara could respond, because apparently this was her show and Clara was just the opening act. Marcus, we came here because family is important. Marriage is important. What you and Clara built together over 5 years, that's not something you throw away because of a few months of confusion. Confusion. I let the word hang in the air for a moment, tasting it. Is that what we're calling it now? Clara made a mistake, Judith continued, like I hadn't spoken. She admits that. She's learned from it. She's grown. And now she wants to come home and rebuild what you two had together. That should count for something. I looked at Clara, who was nodding along like her mother was delivering the gospel according to second chances. She'd been quiet so far, letting Judith carry the argument, but something in her posture suggested she was building up to her own speech. I've been in therapy, Clara said finally, and there it was, the opening line of what sounded like a carefully prepared presentation. Individual therapy, group therapy, even some sessions specifically about relationship patterns and communication. I understand now what I was running from, why I made the choices I made. I understand that what we had was real, Marcus. It was the realest thing in my life, and I threw it away because I was scared. She paused, like she expected me to jump in with reassurance or questions or some sign that her psychological insights were having the desired effect. When I didn't, she kept going. Marcus, the other Marcus. He represented this fantasy I had about being someone different, someone more successful, more sophisticated. But it was just that, a fantasy. When it all fell apart, when I saw what he really was, I realized that what I'd been looking for was already here. With you. In the life we'd built together. It was a good speech. Hell, it was a great speech. 6 months ago, it probably would have worked. It hit all the right notes. Acknowledgement of wrongdoing, evidence of personal growth, recognition of what we'd shared, promises about the future. If this had been a romantic comedy, this would have been the moment where the music swelled and I realized that true love conquers all and everyone lives happily ever after. But this wasn't a romantic comedy. This was real life, where actions have consequences and some bells can't be unrung and some trust, once broken, can't be reassembled with therapy sessions and pretty speeches. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. I believe that you've learned things about yourself, that you understand your patterns better, that you're genuinely sorry for how things ended. But Clara, you don't miss me. You miss security. You miss having someone who loved you enough to be your backup plan when your first choice didn't work out. Judith started to object, but I held up a hand because I was done being interrupted in conversations about my own life. For 5 years, I thought we were building something together. I continued. I thought we were a team, partners, two people choosing each other every day. But the minute something that looked shinier came along, you were gone. Not gradually, not after we tried to work through problems, not after any kind of conversation about what wasn't working. Just gone. Engaged to someone else while you were still married to me. Clara's eyes were filling with tears, but they looked different from the tears she'd cried 6 months ago when her fairy tale was falling apart. These looked real, like maybe she was finally understanding that some consequences are permanent. I deserve someone who chooses me first, I said, feeling Elise's presence beside me like an anchor. Not someone who chooses me because everyone else turned out to be a disappointment. I deserve someone who doesn't need to lose everything to figure out what they had. Judith opened her mouth to argue. Probably something about forgiveness and Christian charity and giving people second chances, but I was already moving toward the door. I forgive you, I said to Clara, and realized as I said it that I actually meant it. I forgive you for blowing up our marriage, for asking me to pay for your wedding to another man, for treating me like a convenience instead of a person. But forgiving you doesn't mean taking you back. It just means I'm done carrying your mistakes around with me. The silence that followed felt like the end of something, final and clean in a way that nothing had felt since this whole mess started. Clara looked like she wanted to say something else, make one more argument, but even she seemed to understand that some doors, once closed, don't open again. Mr. Alvarez, Julian's building superintendent, was watering the plants in the hallway when they left. He nodded approvingly as Clara and Judith walked past him toward the elevator, then looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested he'd seen this particular drama play out before. Good for you, he said quietly. Some people, they think everyone else exists to catch them when they fall. Takes courage to let them hit the ground instead. That evening, Elise and I finished installing her kitchen outlet and celebrated with takeout Chinese food eaten off paper plates because her dining room was currently functioning as a tool storage area. We didn't talk about Clara or the conversation or what it meant for us going forward. We just sat on her living room floor, sharing lo mein and talking about whether her bathroom needed an exhaust fan upgrade and what kind of tile would work best for her kitchen backsplash. Normal conversations about normal problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough patience. The kind of life I'd thought I was building with Clara but had never actually had until now. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, the last door that had been hanging open finally clicked shut. Moving in with Elise felt like the most natural thing in the world. None of that awkward, whose stuff goes where bullshit that usually comes with combining two lives. Her townhouse had good bones and better electrical than most places built in the 80s, plus a balcony just big enough for the tomato plants she'd been babying since spring and the pepper seedlings we'd started together at the kitchen table. The promotion to electrical supervisor at the hospital came with a raise that meant I could finally stop crashing on Julian's couch financially, as well as literally. Leading a crew felt right in ways I hadn't expected, teaching Kyle and the other apprentices that patience mattered more than speed, that doing things right the first time saved everyone headaches down the road. Funny how explaining something to someone else forces you to understand it better yourself. Saturday mornings at Habitat had evolved too. Elise and I were talking about adopting a dog from the shelter downtown. Something good with kids since half our weekends involve families like the Martinezes bringing homemade food and asking us to explain why their outlets worked. Real conversations about real futures with someone who chose to be there instead of someone looking for an exit strategy. The divorce papers came through on a Tuesday that felt like any other Tuesday, which seemed fitting somehow. No drama, no last-minute phone calls. Just a manila envelope that officially confirmed what I'd known for months. Some chapters in so you can start writing better ones. That afternoon, I was coiling wire for tomorrow's job when it hit me. This was what building something actually looked like. Not the desperate, frantic construction of trying to hold someone else's attention, but the steady, patient work of creating something that would last. Wire coiled flat and smooth, no tangles, ready for whatever came next. Just like my life now. Straight, steady, and ready for whatever I decided to build.